The ice was breaking, and the sound of it carried across the fjord like a warning no one could answer. Duke Corwin Ashcombe stood at the edge of the frozen shore in the grey light before noon, and he counted them again because he could not believe the number. 12 wolves, stranded on a single sheet of ice that had torn loose from the bank and was drifting slowly and without mercy toward the open sea. The animals did not howl. They stood pressed together at the center of the flow, ears flat, watching the black water widen between themselves and the land. That silence was worse than any cry. In the winter of 1873, Blackthorn Fjord had frozen harder than any man living could remember, and now the thaw beneath the surface was taking back what the cold had given. "Your Grace, you cannot mean to go out there," said Halloran the steward, gripping the Duke's arm. "The ice will not hold a man. It barely holds the beasts." "It is holding them now," Corwin said, "and the sea is taking them anyway. They are wolves, my lord. By spring they would have come for the lambs regardless. Let the water do what the hunters have wanted done for years." Corwin looked at the old steward for a long moment. The wind pulled at both their coats. "Bring the longest ropes from the boathouse," he said. "Bring the flatboat, the one we use for reeds, and bring every man who is not a coward, which I suspect will leave us short." By the time the household had gathered on the shore, the flow had drifted the length of 2 fields from the bank. Corwin stripped his heavy coat and tied a rope about his waist, and he stepped onto the first slab of shore ice with the care of a man walking across the back of a sleeping animal. The cold came through his boots at once, a pain so sharp it felt like burning. Behind him, the men paid out the rope. Ahead of him, the wolves had begun to understand that something was coming toward them, and they did not know whether to fear it more than the sea. He reached the widening channel of black water and saw that it was too far to leap, so he did the thing the steward had begged him not to do. He lowered himself into the freezing water, and he swam. What followed was spoken of for years afterward in the village, and in places much farther than the village. 3 times the Duke crossed that channel, dragging the flatboat behind him, and 3 times he loaded it with as many wolves as the trembling boards would carry. The animals, half frozen and beyond fight, allowed it. One large grey male, plainly the leader of the pack, was the last to leave the flow, and he would not enter the boat until every other wolf was gone. When at last Corwin reached for him, the wolf set his teeth against the Duke's sleeve, not to bite, but to hold, the way a drowning man holds the hand that saves him. They came ashore together as the ice that had carried them broke apart and slid beneath the swells. Corwin lay on the frozen bank, unable to feel his own hands, and counted a 4th time. 12, every one. "You are mad," Halloran whispered, wrapping him in wool. "You are the maddest man in the north." "Light the fires in the lower barn," Corwin said through chattering teeth. "They will not survive the night in the open." He did not know, lying there, that the act would travel far beyond the fjord. He did not know that within a fortnight, the newspapers in the south would print the story of the grieving Duke who had braved the winter sea to save a pack of wolves, and that the tale would grow with every printing until he scarcely recognized himself in it. And he certainly did not know that the same story would bring a stranger to his door, a woman who would prove harder to manage than the sea. Her name was Tamsin Valewood, and she had not come to admire him. She had come because of the wolf that would not leave. For 3 years, Tamsin had been writing the same argument and watching the same doors close upon it. The learned men of the South held that the wolf was a creature of appetite and nothing more, an engine of teeth that killed because killing was its only nature. Tamsin believed they were wrong. She had spent 2 winters in the high country of Scotland watching the last scattered packs, and she had seen things the gentlemen in their warm rooms refused to credit. She had seen a pack carry food the length of a glen to a wolf too injured to hunt. She had seen them grieve. She had written it all down, and she had submitted it to the Linnaean men and to the Naturalist Review and to anyone who would take a letter, and they had returned her work with the same patient cruelty each time. Interesting, they wrote, but unscientific. Sentimental. The observations of a woman who has mistaken her own feelings for the workings of an animal's mind. So when the newspapers carried the story of a pack of 12 held together on the ice, a pack whose leader had refused rescue until every other wolf was safe, Tamsin Valewood read it, standing up in a cold lending library, and felt her whole argument come alive in a single paragraph. Here was proof. Here, if it were true, was the loyalty the gentleman swore did not exist, witnessed by a duke and half a parish. She did not believe a word of the newspapers, who would print anything. But if even a tenth of it were real, it was the evidence that could carry her book past the closed doors at last. She had written ahead to the duke. He had not answered. So she had come anyway, with a satchel of papers, a half-finished manuscript, and the last of her money paid out to a carter. She arrived in the 3rd week of January. She was 29, dressed plainly for travel, with the steady gaze of a person accustomed to being doubted and answering doubt with more of the same. "Duke Ashcombe," she said when he came into the hall, still in his riding boots. "I am Tamsin Valewood. I write for the Naturalist Review when they will have me, and I have come about the wolves." "I gathered as much," Corwin said. "You have come a long way to be disappointed. The story is not what the papers made it. They make a legend of a man simply because he could not stand to watch animals drown." "I have no interest in the legend of you, Your Grace. The papers may keep it." She set her satchel down upon the hall table and opened it without invitation. "I am interested in one fact, and one only. They printed that the grey male would not board your boat until the other 11 were safe. Is that true? Or is it the sort of thing a journalist adds to make readers weep?" Corwin had not expected the question, and it caught him off his guard. Few people in his life had spoken to him so directly, and almost none of them had been strangers, and none at all had been women who arrived uninvited in the dead of winter. "It is true," he said slowly. "He held my arm in his teeth and would not let me lift him until the boat had carried the last of them off. Why does that one fact matter to you above the rest?" "Because I have spent 3 years trying to prove that wolves do precisely that," Tamsin said. "And 3 years being told by clever men that they do no such thing, that I have invented loyalty where there is only instinct. If your grey male did what you say, then he is the best witness I have ever found, and I intend to observe him until I understand him." She closed the satchel. "I will need to stay. If you have no room, I will lodge in the village. But I will see those wolves, Your Grace, and I will see them for as long as it takes, because they are not a charming story to me. They are my life's work, and I have very little of that work left before the doors close on it for good." Halloran, by the door, made a small sound that he disguised as a cough. Corwin looked at her properly for the first time, and saw not a curiosity-seeker, but a person with a purpose as stubborn as his own. "You may stay," he said, "but the wolves are wild creatures recovering from the edge of death. You will not handle them. You will not crowd them. You will watch and you will write your facts, and when you have them, you will go." "I always write my facts," she said. "It is the going I have never been good at. I tend to stay until a thing is finished." The lower barn had become the wolves' winter shelter, half open to a fenced run that Corwin had built against the hillside. When Tamsin first stood at the rail in the morning cold and saw them, 12 wolves moving easily across the snow, their breath rising in the still air, she said nothing at all for a long time. The Duke watched her instead of the animals. He had expected delight or fear. What he saw was concentration, the fierce stillness of a person who has waited a long while for a thing and cannot quite believe it has arrived. "They are real," she said at last, very quietly, and began to write. For a fortnight she watched them as a soldier watches a road. She rose before the household and was at the rail by first light. She marked which wolf ate first and which waited, which slept against which, how the grey male moved through the pack and how the pack moved around him. She filled one book and began a second, and every morning the Duke happened to be at the rail as well, though he told himself he came only to check on the animals, and they fell into the habit of talking, which began as argument and slowly became something else. "You keep them penned out of vanity," she told him on the third morning. "A trophy of your fame. It would be kinder to let them go to the hills." "They are not strong enough for the hills, as you would know if you had ever kept a starving animal alive," he answered. "And you romanticize them. That grey male you so admire would open your throat without a thought if you climbed that rail in a hard winter." "He would not," she said. "He would weigh whether I was a threat and decide I was not, and ignore me. You have seen him do it." "You simply will not say so, because then you would have to agree with me, and you would rather be cold and correct than warm and outvoted." He found, to his irritation, that he had no answer to that, and that he did not entirely mind losing. It was the grey wolf that changed things between them. The leader of the pack had grown strong enough to range the run, and one bright frozen morning he came to the rail where Tamsin stood and laid his great head against the wood, close enough to touch. She did not move. She held her breath. Behind her, very softly, Corwin spoke. "Do not reach for him. Let him decide." She let him decide. The wolf studied her with eyes the colour of winter sun, and then he turned and walked back to the pack, having judged her and found her tolerable. Tamsin wrote 3 lines in her book with a hand that was not quite steady, and when she had finished, she found there were tears standing in her eyes, and she was furious at herself for them. "I did not come here to weep at wolves," she said. "No," Corwin agreed, "and I did not come here to admire a journalist. We are both behaving very badly." She laughed, surprised out of her composure, and the sound of it did something to him that he had not felt in 4 years. That night they sat by the great fire in the library, because the wind had risen to a gale, and there was nothing else to do, and they talked of things that had nothing to do with wolves, and everything to do with who they were. He learned that her father had been a country physician who let her read his books, that she had buried him 2 winters past, and that she had spent the last of his small legacy on 2 seasons in the Scottish hills, chasing an idea no one would publish. She learned that the Duke had married young, that his wife had been named Rosalind, that Rosalind had died of a fever 4 years ago in the spring, and that he had not had a true conversation with anyone in his own house since. "Is that why you live here, at the edge of everything?" Tamsin asked. "I live here because she loved it," Corwin said, "and because here no one expects me to recover. In the South, they grow tired of grief after a year. They want you mended, so they need not be reminded that mending is not always possible." He turned the question back on her, because he had learned she preferred plain dealing. "And you? Why does it matter so much that the world believes a wolf can be loyal? It is a strange thing to give your whole life to." Tamsin was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "Because I have been told my whole life that what I see is not real," she said. "That a woman feels things and mistakes them for knowledge. When I write that a wolf grieves, the gentlemen do not argue the wolf. They argue me. They say I am sentimental, that I lack rigor, that I should write about gardens." She looked up. "If I can prove this one thing with witnesses and measurements they cannot wave away, then they cannot say it of the next thing or the thing after. It was never only about the wolves, Your Grace. It is about being believed." Corwin looked at her for a long moment across the firelight. "Then we are not so different," he said. "You have spent your life trying to make the world believe you, and I have spent mine trying to make it leave me alone. I am not certain which of us has chosen worse." She did not answer that. She understood that some things are better left in the silence where they are true. The next morning, everything changed because a carriage came up the frozen road that did not belong to the country at all. The man who stepped out of it was named Augustus Pell, and he was not what either of them expected. Tamsin had imagined the kind of soft, ringed gentleman who buys his way through the world, and instead there came down from the carriage a lean man of perhaps 50, with the hands of someone who had once done hard work, and the eyes of someone who had decided never to do it again. His coat was fine, but he wore it like armor rather than ornament. He did not smile easily, and when he did, it was the smile of a man who has learned that smiling is useful. He represented, he said, a consortium of investors from the manufacturing cities, and he had come about the fjord, the deep water of Blackthorn, frozen now but open and sheltered in the warmer months, was ideally suited to a new harbour and a smelting works. The forests of the surrounding hills would feed the furnaces. The cliffs would be quarried. It would bring labour and wages, and it would make the Duke a wealthy man. And the land you describe, Corwin said slowly, is the land where the wolves now run. The wolves. Pell did not sneer, as Tamsin had braced herself for him to do. He simply looked tired. "Your Grace, I have read of your wolves. It was a brave thing you did. I will not pretend otherwise." He set his hat upon his knee. "May I tell you where I was born, before you decide what kind of man I am? I was born in a court off Ancoats Lane in Manchester, the 7th of 9, and 4 of us did not see 10 years old. My mother washed other people's linen until her hands bled. There were no wolves where I grew up, Your Grace. There was no wild coast to weep over. There was hunger and there was cold, and there was the workhouse waiting like a mouth at the end of the street." The room had gone very quiet. Tamsin, who had come prepared to despise him, found that she could not look away. "The works I build," Pell went on, "put bread on tables. I have seen children who would have died in a court like mine grow fat and live, because their fathers had wages from a furnace I raised. You have 12 wolves, Your Grace. I am offering this valley 300 families who will never know what it is to bury a child for want of a fire. I do not ask you to love what I build. I ask you only to weigh it honestly. 12 animals against 300 families. Tell me the arithmetic by which the wolves win, and I will get back in my carriage and trouble you no more." Corwin said nothing for so long that the fire could be heard. "You will take tea," he said at last, with perfect courtesy, "and then we will speak again. You have given me a great deal to weigh, and I will not insult you by answering quickly." When Pell had been shown to a room, Tamsin turned on the Duke, her face pale. "You are not actually considering it." "He buried 4 brothers and sisters," Corwin said. "Did you hear nothing he said?" "I heard a clever man who has learned exactly which story softens a heart," Tamsin said, "and I believe every word of it is true, which is what makes him dangerous. A liar I could fight. A man who has truly known that hunger and decided the answer is to pour the whole world into a furnace. Him I cannot simply call wicked. But he is wrong, Corwin. He is wrong, and his being right about Manchester does not make him right about this valley." It was the first time she had used his given name. Neither of them remarked on it. But the room felt different afterward. Pell did not leave the region after his tea. He lodged at a manor 2 valleys distant and began, quietly, to do the work that such men do. He spoke to the magistrate. He spoke to the men of the village, the ones who had lost livestock to hard winters and buried children of their own in lean years. And to them he did not speak of arithmetic. He spoke of warm houses and full bellies and work that did not depend upon the mercy of the weather. He produced surveys and old documents, and a clever argument that the foreshore of the fjord, the very tide line where the ice had broken, was Crown land and not the Duke's at all, and that the Crown might be persuaded to lease it to a man of vision. And the worst of it was that the village began to listen, because the village had buried children too, and Pell was the first man of fortune who had ever spoken to them as though their hunger mattered. "He will win," Halloran said grimly one evening. "Men like that always win in the end, and the devil of it is, half of what he says is true. My own sister lost 2 babes to the cold winters when we were young. If a furnace would have saved them, who am I to curse the man who builds it?" Tamsin set down her pen. "Then we do not curse him," she said. "We answer him. He says the wolves are worth nothing against 300 families. I will prove the wild coast is worth more than smoke, and that there are kinds of value that do not vanish in a generation the way a furnace town does when the ore runs out." She looked at Corwin. "But I cannot do it alone. I have a manuscript no one will publish, and a theory no one believes. You have a name the whole country read about 3 weeks ago. If we put them together, his arithmetic is not the only arithmetic in the room." Corwin looked at her. "We? You did not think I would write a charming little article and go home, did you? I came here for my wolves, Your Grace, and that man means to have them shot for sport once his furnaces stand. If he wins, my life's work dies on this shore along with them. So yes, we." She paused. "Unless you would rather face him alone. You are very practiced at facing things alone." It was the sharpest thing she had said to him, and the kindest, and he knew it for both. "Stay," he said. "Help me. And I am sorry to say it, but I begin to think we will need more than a name and a manuscript. We will need to beat his arithmetic with better arithmetic, and I do not yet know where we will find it." So they fought together, and the fighting drew them closer than the quiet had. They rode out across the snow to map the boundaries of the disputed land, the grey wolf and his pack sometimes trailing them at a distance like an escort. And Tamsin filled her books with everything she saw, because she had decided that the only way to beat a man of figures was with figures of her own. She counted the herring runs that came into the fjord in the open season and the men who fished them. She wrote down how many families lived already by the wild coast, the fishers and the foresters and the gatherers of Eider Down, and what they earned, and she began to build a case that the living the valley already made was no smaller than the living a furnace would bring, and that it would not poison the water, nor strip the hills bare, nor vanish when the ore was gone. "He thinks I have only my heart," she said one night, surrounded by papers at the library table. "He thinks a woman brings nothing to a fight but feeling, so I will bring him a ledger he cannot argue with, and I will make the gentlemen who would not publish me read it whether they wish to or not. And in the riding and the counting and the long nights at the table, something happened that neither of them named. One evening, walking back along the frozen shore beneath a moon so bright it cast their shadows on the snow, Tamsin slipped on the ice, and Corwin caught her, and for a moment neither of them stepped back. The wind had dropped. The whole fjord was silver and still. "I think," Tamsin said carefully, "that I have stayed longer than is proper." "Yes," Corwin said, "and I think I do not wish to leave, which frightens me more than the wolves ever did." "Why frightens you?" She drew back from him gently because the honesty cost her something, because I came north to prove myself and go home a name the gentleman could not ignore. That was the whole of my life, Corwin. Every penny, every winter, every door shut in my face, all of it spent to buy one thing, which was to be believed and to matter in the world. And now I stand on a frozen shore at the end of the earth, and I find I would trade it. I find part of me would rather stay here and be no one at all, so long as I could stay here with you. And I do not know that woman. I have never met her, and I am not sure I trust her." Corwin was quiet for a long moment. "I will not ask you to trade it," he said at last. "I have watched what it costs you to be doubted, and I would sooner cut off my hand than be the reason you stop fighting to be believed. So I will not catch you when you fall, Tamsin, not in that way, much as I should like to. You came here for something, finish it, And if when it is finished you still wish to stay, then ask me again, and you will not find me cold." It was not a refusal, and they both knew it was not a refusal. But it was honest, and the honesty hurt, and Tamsin lay awake that night and wondered whether she had crossed half the country to win an argument and lose her heart in the same winter, and whether a person was allowed to want both. The threat came to its point in the second week of February. Pell had secured a hearing before the magistrate to press his claim upon the foreshore, and he had done his work well. The villagers who crowded into the hall were divided down the middle, and the division ran through families. The magistrate, a tired and careful man, let Pell speak first, and Pell did not speak of arithmetic to that room. He spoke of the winter of 1847, which the older folk remembered, when the snow had closed the valley for 9 weeks, and 11 souls had died, 4 of them children. He named the children. He had learned their names. And when he had finished, there were men weeping in that hall, and Tamsin understood that they were not facing a villain at all, but something far worse, a man who had taken real grief and forged it into a weapon, and who perhaps did not even know that was what he had done. Then the magistrate turned to the Duke. "Your Grace, the question is plain. Mr. Pell argues that the foreshore is Crown land, and that the Crown's interest is best served by prosperity. If you cannot show that the foreshore is held by your house, the law must take its course, and I have no power to choose wolves over a furnace merely because the story is a pretty one." Corwin rose. He had no deed. He had searched every record in the house and found nothing, and he knew it. But he had Tamsin's ledger under his arm, and he had decided that if they were to lose, they would lose having forced the room to do the arithmetic honestly. "Mr. Pell speaks the truth about the winter of 47, he said. "I will not dishonor those children by pretending otherwise. But he asks you to weigh 12 wolves against 300 families, and that is not the true sum, and he knows it is not." He opened the ledger. "There are already 400 souls who make their living from this coast as it stands, fishing and forestry and the gathering of down, and Miss Valewood has spent a month counting them. When the furnace strips the hills and fouls the water, as such works always do, those 400 do not move into Mr. Pell's town. They are simply ruined to make room for his 300. He does not offer this valley 300 new families. He offers to trade 400 old ones for 300 new ones, and to take the wild coast as his fee for the exchange." The room shifted. Pell's face did not change, but Tamsin, watching him, saw his jaw tighten, and she knew the figures had landed. It was then, as Corwin reached the end of what he could prove, that Tamsin stood up beside him with a folded paper in her hand and her face very pale. "There is a deed," she said. The room went quiet. "I was searching the Duke's library a week past," she said, "for any record that might help our cause, and I found a writing case that had not been opened in some years. It belonged to the late Duchess." She looked at Corwin, and her eyes were full of an apology she could not yet explain. "Forgive me. I did not have your leave to open it, but I knew you could not bear to." Corwin had gone very still. "The Duchess Rosalind," Tamsin went on, turning to the magistrate, "loved this coast above any place on earth. 4 years ago, in the last spring of her life, she did a thing she told no one of. She purchased the foreshore rights outright from the Crown, in her own name and with her own money, and she placed them in a trust. Not for herself, not for her husband, for the land. She wrote that the wild things of Blackthorn Fjord should never be sold, nor quarried, nor driven out, so long as her family held the title. The deed is signed and witnessed and sealed. It is law." She laid the paper on the table before the magistrate, and her hand was shaking. "She protected this place before any of us thought it needed protecting. She simply did not live long enough to tell anyone." The magistrate read the deed twice. Then he set it down and looked at Pell, and there was no warmth in his face. "The matter is closed," he said. "The foreshore is held in trust, and the trust forbids the works. There is no crown land here to lease you, sir." Pell rose. He did not bluster. He looked at the deed for a long moment, and then he looked at Corwin and Tamsin, and something in his weathered face that had been clenched for 30 years seemed, very briefly, to loosen. "You think me a hard man," he said quietly, to the room more than to anyone in it. "Perhaps I am. A soft man does not climb out of an Ancoats court, but I have spent my life trying to spare other children what I was not spared, and I have learned today that I had only counted half the sum." He looked at Tamsin's ledger where it lay upon the table. 400 souls. You are right that I did not count them. I should have. A man who buries his own and then forgets to count another man's dead has become the thing he hated. He took up his hat. "I will build my furnace where it is wanted, and there is more than one valley in this country that will weep with gratitude for it. But I will not build it on the backs of 400 to save 300, and I will not be the man who shoots a duke's wolves for sport. Good day to you. You fought fairly. That is rarer than you know." And he went out, and his carriage went down the frozen road, and it was not the exit of a beaten villain, but of a man who had been shown a number he could not unsee, and Tamsin found that she did not hate him at all, and that this was somehow harder than hating him would have been. Corwin did not speak until they were home. He carried the writing case into the library himself, and set it on the table by the fire, and he sat before it as a man sits before something he has feared for a long time. Tamsin stood by the door, ready to leave him to it. "Stay," he said quietly. "Please." So she stayed, and he opened the case the rest of the way, and beneath the deed he found what she had not disturbed. Letters. A small bundle of them, tied with ribbon that Rosalind had written in the weeks before. The fever took her and never given to him, perhaps meaning to, perhaps not. He held them for a long time without reading them. "She knew," he said at last. "She knew this place would be wanted one day. She knew I would not be able to protect it alone, because the only way I know to protect a thing is by main force, by swimming into the sea after it. She protected it with patience and law in secret, and she trusted that someone would find it when the time came." He looked up at Tamsin. "She trusted that someone would open the case I could not open. I have left it shut for 4 years. You opened it in a week." "I'm sorry," Tamsin began. "I had no right." "You had every right," Corwin said. "You are the only person in 4 years who has looked at the shut door of me and simply opened it on the grounds that it ought not to stay shut. I have been angry at you for it since the day you arrived." He set the letters down. "I am not angry now." He read the letters that night, alone, and Tamsin did not ask what was in them. But in the morning he came to the rail where she stood watching the wolves, and he stood beside her in the cold, and after a while he spoke. "She wrote that she did not want me to grieve forever," he said. "She wrote it more than once, as though she knew I would need to be told twice. She wrote that the worst thing I could do with the years she did not get was to refuse to live them." He turned to Tamsin. "I have been refusing to live them. I should like to stop. But I made you a promise on the shore, that I would not ask you to trade your work for me, and I will keep it. So I will not ask you to stay. I will ask you something else." He paused. "Finish your book. Go south and make them publish it and make them believe you, every last one of them. And know while you do it that there is a house at the edge of the world with the door standing open, and a man in it who has stopped being cold, and 12 wolves who will judge you tolerable every time you return. Come and go as your work requires. I will not make you choose between the wild coast and the wider world. I will only make sure that whenever you are weary of the world, the coast is here, and so am I." Tamsin Valewood, who had spent her life being told that a woman must choose between being loved and being believed, found that she had no clever answer at all. She had only the truth. "You would let me have both," she said. "You would not even ask me to give up the one for the other." "It is what she would have done," Corwin said. "She taught me, 4 years too late, that the way you keep a wild thing is not by penning it. So no, I will not pen you either. Come back to me of your own will or not at all. But I think you will come back." "I think I will too," Tamsin said, and she put her gloved hand in his. There at the rail with 12 wolves watching from the snow. The grey wolf lifted his head at the sound of her voice, and then he turned and led the pack out across the white hill toward the trees, free as the woman who saved them had wished, and as the man who pulled them from the sea was only now beginning to learn that he could be himself. 6 winters came and went over Blackthorn Fjord, and the coast remained wild. Tamsin's book was published in the autumn of the year they met, and then again in a second printing, and then a third, for it turned out that a great many people had been waiting to be told that loyalty was not the sole property of men. The gentlemen who had called her sentimental were obliged one by one to write careful letters admitting that her observations had merit, which she kept in a drawer and reread on difficult days. She was made a corresponding member of 2 societies that had never before admitted a woman, and she went south each year to lecture, and each year she came home to the fjord with the relief of a creature returning to its own country. She had won the thing she crossed the world for, and she had found, to her continual surprise, that winning it had cost her nothing she wished to keep, because the man at the edge of the world had never once asked her to lay it down. The smelting works were never built, there nor anywhere within the bounds of the trust, but Augustus Pell raised his furnaces 3 valleys to the south, in a place that had no wild coast and wanted the work, and it was said that he counted every soul twice now before he laid a single stone, and that he kept a ledger of the living as carefully as of the dead. He sent Tamsin a copy of her own book one Christmas, asking her to sign it. She did. The wolves bred and ranged and grew into a true pack of the hills. The old grey leader, who had held the Duke's arm in his teeth on the breaking ice and would not be saved until his pack was safe, grew slow at last, and one winter he laid down in the snow near the tree line and did not rise. Corwin found him there and sat with him a long while, and told no one but Tamsin what passed between them, if anything passed at all. But the grey wolf had left descendants, and on a bright frozen morning in the 6th winter, a small girl of 4 years stood at the same rail where her mother had once stood, bundled to the eyes in wool. Her name was Rosalind, for it had seemed right, and no one had argued. She was watching something at the edge of the trees, and she had gone very still, the way her mother went still when something mattered. "There," she whispered, and pointed. At the tree line, half hidden in the snow, stood a wolf cub of perhaps 8 or 9 months, grey as iron, watching the house with eyes the colour of winter sun. It was the old leader's blood. Anyone could see it in the build of him and the way he held his head, and he had come down the hill alone, the way young wolves do when they are first testing the size of the world. The little girl raised one small mittened hand, very solemnly, as though greeting an old friend she had been told about all her life, but never met. The young grey wolf watched her. He did not run. For a long moment, the child at the rail and the cub at the trees regarded one another across the white field, 2 young things meeting at the start of their lives, neither one yet afraid of anything. Then an older wolf called from the forest, and the cub turned and bounded back into the trees, and was gone. Behind the child, Tamsin leaned against the Duke with her head upon his shoulder, and neither of them spoke, because some things are spoiled by speaking. "His grandsire would have liked her," Corwin said finally. "His grandsire judged me tolerable on a Tuesday," Tamsin said, "and never once changed his mind. I expect this one will do the same for her." She watched her daughter, who was still gazing at the empty tree line as though the world had just shown her its best secret. "She is not afraid of them. No, Corwin said. She has never been afraid of anything that matters. I cannot think where she gets it. Tamsin smiled and did not dignify that with a reply. Corwin Ashcombe, who had once been the loneliest man in the north, stood in the cold with his wife and his daughter and the warmth of a house that was no longer quiet, and he thought of a morning long ago when he had counted 12 wolves on the breaking ice and could not bear to let the sea take them. He had thought, in those years, that he was saving them. He understood now that the act of mercy had never run in only one direction. He had pulled 12 lives from the water, and the water, in its slow and roundabout way, had given him back a life of his own, and then had let that life run on into a small girl at a rail, raising her hand to a wolf cub who would still be running these hills long after all of them were gone. If this story warmed you on a cold day, stay a while, and let me tell you another.